What is one of the biggest problems with people wanting to seek therapy and then sticking with it for a while and then maybe moving on to another therapist and eventually ones that have better and better strengths and fewer weaknesses, more insight? These are my reflections that all too often there's a power struggle going on, wherein each party, the therapist or the client, wishes to believe that basically they're perfect already. Maybe they just need a few tweaks here and there. Hence, I remember once listening to a show by a Dr. Biederman out in the Boston area. And he was a so-called expert on borderline personality disorder, as he called it. And he was saying once that he and staff members in hospitals felt very distraught by the arrogance, as he might have called it, or grandiosity, what have you, in clients there at the hospitals, and that thus there was much contempt toward the clients. And of course, clients feeling this would feel defensive and give it back. How interesting, thus, in a therapy situation outside of a hospital in general, that the therapist with the PhD or MD degree, sometimes less of an issue here with master's degree holders, would want to feel that they know it all already, despite evidence to the contrary in their demeanor and even income level often. And then there being a power struggle because the client, in essence, would like to believe that they have various strengths too, at a minimum, and that it isn't just a parent-child situation or instructor situation, one party claiming to know all and the other supposedly needing to just download it all and take notes, and that there's information being conveyed that perhaps is interpreted thus as dogmatic. How then is this going to play out? And if the client can't see that the therapist is in fact flawed, sometimes considerably, and not be able to handle this, maybe they want to think that they have it together, and the therapist can't admit that with good cause, of course, then perhaps the situation can be volatile, or the person quits after a session or two. And after 2 or 3 attempts at this, simply throws up their hands and say, therapy is for the birds. But then, doesn't this play out the same way when we're talking about growth in general from any source? Like self-help books, or any other textbook for that matter that's not considered self-help, or in terms of a relationship in general. Isn't that then part, I suppose, of why they say therapy is a relationship? I suppose if it were more than a relationship, we would call it a download that's supposed to fix us in 1 hour or 2 or 10. Even the notion that you can fix your life with 10 sessions or less of cognitive therapy instructing you how to think much better. Now, sadly or whatever, I would say a couple other things too that often interfere with a therapeutic process, whereby the therapist might have some really good ideas to convey. First, there could be considerable jealousy, call it envy if you will, from the therapist toward the client. For at least the client is saying that they would like to seek assistance because they think they have a contributing part to play in their pain. And yet how many therapists do the same thing? Once they're minted with their PhD degree or MD degree, and in lesser cases with master's degree holding, Maybe they wish to believe they're thus perfect. They've been inoculated with knowledge. They're now trained experts in every which way, including their character, their personality, as if the book knowledge was supposed to change their personality and make it 100% perfect and downloadable as such. Then the minute a client comes along who claims otherwise, who says they have issues to work on, and furthermore, that they're willing to get slapped upside the head here and there to learn things, then isn't that a confrontation of sorts that one can be envied over or jealous over, what have you, as per choice of words there? Then the client might have more courage in many respects, to include the courage to say they're imperfect. The client might have more intellect. The client might have more intellect, say, in terms of not just a degree, but great acumen in some field, even mathematics, which makes their thinking much more clear than the therapists, who might not have had much mathematical studies or time to ponder much of everything. The person coming as a client might have more integrity of a sort. Call it moral courage, not just courage in general to face fears, but courage to go against the grain. Finally, the client might show up looking more beautiful, or more well-dressed, or have more money than the therapist. There might even be a difference in class, middle class, upper class versus lower class, or a difference in how they handle stress as per their addictions of choice, whether chemically based or non-chemically based. And finally, what about this? Perhaps the therapist simply has so many frustrations from their childhood that it's very convenient to take them out on others. Call it dumping, call it displacement, call it blame shifting. Then there's a setup here whereupon the client is deemed the broken person, the mentally ill person, and the therapist is deemed the perfect person. All the more so if the therapist won't share who they are, where they came from, their flaws, and be vulnerable themselves. That's a power imbalance right there. All the more so if the person is stigmatized as the client with labels or terminology that can get quite ugly, for lack of a better word, and even tell the person they have a broken brain and for life. And the therapy turning into a situation simply to validate the diagnosis of broken brain syndrome, if you will, along with the drugs used for it. Compliance to both being the object then of therapy for some, especially on the lower end of the economic scale. With all of this going on then, is it any wonder that anyone at all goes to therapy or continues it, especially if they've heard horror stories, even of clients committing suicide, or pulling out their hair, or devolving in general, or they've tried it and seen same in their own life. Small wonder then that therapy gets short shrift. I heard one person finally say that therapy can be brutal, a rocky road. And yet, what are the alternatives for most people who are not Einstein in both intellect and level of time and money to devote to reinventing a wheel that hasn't yet really been invented by anybody, in my opinion? If there are the lack of Einsteins in the world, what other alternatives are there but to take a bunch of drugs called medicine, zone out, and claim everybody is a fraud in the therapy circles? Therapy can be quite brutal, especially starting out, when one has little idea of where to turn, what to look for. Those are my thoughts anyway. And one last thought. Perhaps therapy also doesn't seem to get some people very far if they are looking for a therapist who is basically pretty much like they are. Let's say if they're a Christian seeking only Christian therapists, or maybe they want a certain viewpoint right out of the box, like cognitive therapy or psychoanalysis or Rogerian or whatever. Or maybe they're looking for someone of the same socioeconomic class to deliver them information, to basically download from the person's head. Or the same race, same ethnicity, same viewpoint in general, which in every case is generally going to be biased in the sense of a presupposition here and there, a premise being incorrect. Then how are we supposed to get past our own incorrect premises if we pick out therapists who have the same incorrect premises so that we feel most comfortable and unchallenged? And yet hope against all hope. That phrase coming to mind, insanity being the definition of those who try the same thing but want different results.